Well, I'd like to begin with a disclaimer. I'm not here as an academic. I'm here as being purely partisan party to the case against DAP. I represented one of the petitioners, Mr. Belica, and it is with pride that I can claim that contrary to the decision of the Supreme Court itself, which says that the petition was only partially granted, when you read our petition and the dispositive portion of the Supreme Court decision, which is subject of a motion for reconsideration on the part of both the government and petitioner Belica, we're proud to state that all our prayers were in fact granted by the court. So my first point is, as far as the Belica petition is concerned, it was a full victory. There was no prayer that we included in the petition that was not granted by the court. Secondly, we were the petitioner in the first place in an earlier case which invalidated the PDAF and other lump sum appropriations. Now, Belica filed the second case against the DAP because, in fact, in the course of the oral arguments against the PDAF, one of the justices, Justice Bernabe, inquired if the DAP was specifically one of those which petitioners were impugning as a form of pork barrel. And of course, we answered in the affirmative. We said that the DAP is a form of pork barrel. It is a lump sum appropriation, the expenditure which depends on the discretion of one branch of government and is not pursuant to an appropriation made by law, contrary, therefore, to the constitutional provision that no money from the public funds may be paid without an appropriation made by law. Now, because it has been our contention that DAP from the very start is a form of pork barrel, this victory is significant. Because had the court not declared the DAP as unconstitutional, the executive could simply treat every item in the appropriations bill as savings and send it and spend it any which way that it wants, which became the first basis for why the court declared it as unconstitutional. Citing Article 6, Section 5.5 of the 87 Constitution, the court reiterated, and I highlight this fact, no, this is not a precedent-setting case. It only reiterated the case of Demetria versus Alba and another case involving Secretary Caragan, no, where the court said that although the power to realign funds is granted to the President and other heads of constitutional commissions, this is subject to limitations fixed not just by law, but by the Constitution itself. It can only come from savings, and when we say savings, it's real savings, it's leftover funds. After a project had been finished or because a project was abandoned. Secondly, it must be spent within the branch of government that incurred the savings. And third, it must be to augment an existing line item within the branch of government that incurred its savings. No? You cannot arbitrarily, capriciously, and whimsically say that I'm not going to spend this fund and therefore it became savings. Perhaps a very clear example of what this administration did contrary to law is the 1 billion peso allotted for the Tacloban Airport. They simply did not build the airport and instead spent it for any other purpose. When we consider the meaning, the legal meaning of savings, it should have been the fact that they proceeded with the construction of the airport and had leftover funds that could be spent on other items of the budget which did not have sufficient funds. So that was the first ruling of the court. The second ruling of the court is that you cannot use savings to augment items for other branches of government other than the branch of government that incurred the savings. And this was what the court described as cross-border expenditures. Now, this is where the controversy arises, because the administrative code is being cited by the administration as legal basis for the president, in fact, to augment items, not just within the executive, but even in the other branches of government and in the constitutional commissions, as in fact, in the very decision of the Supreme Court, it noted some of the projects involved, funded by the involved projects being implemented either by the senators or by constitutional commissions such as the Commission on Audit, ironically. No? Now, the important thing to underscore is that there is a literal commitment found in the Constitution itself, and this became the ruling of the court. No? Not only must these funds to be used for augmentation come from savings, it must be used in the same department or constitutional commission that incurred the savings. Now, some have read the administrative code to be a blanket authority to augment items not just within the executive, but to other branches of government. No? The problem with this kind of reasoning is that we have such a thing as hierarchy of laws in this country. In fact, not just in this country, but in all countries of the world. In international law, this has become a general principle of law, except in the minds of the president and Mujabat. No state in this planet, okay, will recognize the supremacy of mere administrative rules as against the Constitution. No state in this planet, I have not seen a single state that recognizes that administrative rules can overrule the Constitution regardless of when the administrative rules were promulgated. If there is a conflict between the highest law of the land and any other rule, then it is the highest court of the land that prevails. That's the nature of law as hierarchical. That's the nature of law as part of a normative system. There's some norms which are more important than others. Even in international law, there's some norms that provide for no derogation because they are jus cogens. The same thing works for domestic law as part of a normative system. Although there are different branches of government that can provide for these rules, we have barangay councils, we have Sangguniang Pambayan, we have Sangguniang Panlunsod, we have Congress of the Philippines, even the executive, through executive orders, in effect, can promulgate norms or rules that must be followed. But ultimately, the benchmark of validity is whether or not they comply with the Constitution, and if they violate the Constitution, it becomes null and void. Now, going back to the second ruling, therefore, that is why the court said, you cannot resort to cross-border transfers. Why? Because in that case of Demetria versus Alba, when Marcos attempted to play around with public funds, his PD that the court declared unconstitutional only gave him the power to realign funds within the executive branch of government itself. Meaning, Marcos, the dictator that he was, knew that he could not even resort to cross-border augmentation. What made this president think that he can get away with it? Demetria versus Alba nullified the PD that gave him carte blanche authority to realign funds within the executive. Meaning, even if there were not savings, he could realign it. But already the court said, even if it is within the executive, you cannot do that. More so when it becomes cross-border. Now, the third ruling of the court, of course, is pursuant to the very essence of our representative democracy. No money or no public funds shall be spent without appropriations by law. This is corollary to the principle that there can be no taxation without representation. If you cannot tax the people without consent of their representatives, neither can government spend money without consent of their representative, which became the third ruling of the court. You cannot therefore spend funds for any other purpose that is not otherwise provided by the appropriations law. The fourth point, of course, is after our first speaker defined what unprogrammed funds were, that unprogrammed funds could not be spent without a certification from the National Treasurer that we have sufficient funds to cover them. So insofar as our petition is concerned, the four rulings of the court amounted to a complete victory because that was, in fact, the only points that we questioned. Now, unfortunately, everyone knows, because the president has gone on national TV not once, not twice, but thrice, that they have filed a motion for reconsideration. And we know that more or less what the grounds for the motion for reconsiderations are. Let's begin with the first televised assault on the decision. It is akin to parking in a no parking zone to save a life. Mr. President, simply put, there is no comparison between a traffic ordinance and the Constitution. Number two, well, the second point I think has been addressed earlier. The legal basis is the administrative code. Again, Mr. President, outside of your own world, there is no state in this planet that will accord supremacy to precisely to a mere administrative code rather than the Constitution. Why do I say mere administrative code? The administrative code has to do with organization of the executive branch of government. That simply is the definition of what administrative code is. It is the organization and processes within the executive branch of government. They are remedial in character. They're not even normative. Which is why, in our motion for reconsideration, this is one of the points that we raised. It is not true, as stated in the majority opinion, that budget crafting is mere directory. It is normative. It is normative because the foundation is you cannot spend public funds without appropriation made pursuant to law. And in fact, it is further provided that the appropriations, the manner by which public funds, will also be pursuant to law, and that is governed by the administrative code. Now, why did we move for reconsideration? Well, although the court in effect granted all our prayers, the court was silent, however, on the issue on how much and how could a president augment an existing line item. Now, obviously, the power to augment to an existing line item from savings contemplates adding funds to projects that could not be finished because they require further funds. In other words, before you can augment to an existing line item, there must be a shortfall, a budgetary shortfall. But the examples that we cited in our motion for reconsideration included Tarlac Highway Project. From 1 billion, it was augmented by 900 million, almost double. Research and development for DOST, initial budget 6 million, amount augmented 300 million. Now, when you augment to an item in an existing line item in the budget, that means budgetary shortfall. You cannot come up with a new project altogether. And when you double a budget, that's a new project. Because the cost, particularly of infra, is already calculated by the DPWH, including a hefty 30% return on investment for the contractor. So that's in the motion for reconsideration, and we argued that unless the court rules in fact that any augmentation without a budgetary shortfall is unconstitutional, then this becomes a loophole for the executive. They will simply say, well, every item that we want to increase could be augmented, even if what the executive truly intends to do is to substitute its discretion and judgment on what funds to fund. And of course, it is to substitute their discretion over and above what Congress had already decreed through the passage of the appropriations law. So that is the pending motion for reconsideration. But I will go on and take liberties because I am so far the lone lawyer in the panel of speakers. We are also contemplating a separate action because the rules provide for a separate action. And this is a petition to cite the president in contempt of court. When you cite a president or anyone for contempt of court, among others, for contumacious acts. And what contumacious acts do we feel the president committed in his no less than three public address against the Supreme Court and its decision on the DAP? Well, obviously, in the first televised address, he, in effect, threatened the court that there will be bangayan, is the word that he used. Because he used, I think he spoke in Tagalog, or was it in English in the first one? I think he spoke in Tagalog the first one, English in the second one, and then English again yesterday, if I'm not mistaken. But in the first one, he said there will be bangayan between two branches of government that would lead to the involvement of a third branch of government. This executive was in fact threatening the court with a constitutional crisis unless it reverses its decision on the DAP. I have been practicing for 25 years. I am an activist. I have been testing the limits of the sub judice rule. I have gotten away with it, but I think the president crossed the line. You don't bully a co-equal branch of government just because you want them to reverse one of their decisions. You simply don't do that in a democracy. It is the job, and in fact, the obligation and function, the duty of the Supreme Court to uphold the supremacy of the Constitution. It is the responsibility of the Supreme Court to tell presidents and Congress what it cannot do because it is barred by the Constitution. And when the court so declares an act to be unconstitutional, that is because it is upholding not the supremacy of the judicial branch of government, but the supremacy of the Constitution itself. The threat of the president, therefore, of an impending constitutional crisis is a threat to the Constitution itself, not just to the Supreme Court or the judiciary. That, in my mind, is the ultimate contempt coming from the highest executive of the land, duty-bound to implement the law. Who will follow the law now that the President himself has shown nothing but contemptuous conduct towards a decision that he does not agree with? Lahat na lang ba tayo, sasabihin natin, babagkakaroon ng bangayan dahil hindi natin gusto ang desisyon? Ganun ba ang gusto niya? Magpatayan na lang tayo sa labas? At magsumunod sa mga order ng ating hukuman? Well, of course, part of the study that we're undertaking is he has immunity from suits. And it is recognized that the filing of a petition for contempt is akin to a criminal case. Be that as it may, our preliminary conclusion is that he may not in fact be sent to jail by the Supreme Court for contempt. But he can of course be reminded by the Supreme Court of the Constitution, the nature of the Constitution, and the limits of executive powers. That does not include bullying other branches of government into deciding the way the President wants them to decide. Full stop. I think I've said a mouthful now. And I have also noticed that my blood pressure is rising. So ladies and gentlemen, I will stop momentarily, but I shall come back for the open forum. Thank you. Good afternoon.